This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBarry. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
All right, well, we're going to continue in the series that we've been on for the last two Sundays before tonight, and that is from Revelation chapter 17, the first 6 verses. And the study on Mystery Babylon. We've looked over the last 2 weeks, first of all, at what the religion of ancient Babel was. And then last week we looked at a number of different emblems, logos, symbols of that religion of Mystery Babylon and how it is still alive and well today, even in the 21st century, and how you can actually see it in many of the corporate logos, many of the religious symbols that are around even today, so that ancient religion of the Tower of Babel is still very much alive and well today. And we know it is going to be the worldwide religion during the tribulation period. Now tonight we're going to continue in that same discussion of the religion of Mystery Babylon that will exist during the tribulation period. But I want to do something a little bit different. I have given bits and pieces of what we're going to talk about tonight along the way over the last 2 years in various messages that I have preached and Sunday school lessons that I have taught. But I don't think I have ever put all of the information I'm going to give you tonight together in one presentation. And I'll go ahead and say it's totally biblical, but it's not totally politically correct. So having said that, the title of my message is Israel and Mystery Babylon. Now I want to start tonight by saying we are not intentionally throwing stones at any group of people. It is, of course, one of the things that's not politically correct today to say anything against Israel or against Jewish people. What I'm going to say tonight is not in regards to the individuals who are Jewish people, but it is in regards to the religion of the Jews, the religion that they practice today, the religion that they practiced in Jesus' day, and the religion that they practiced in Old Testament times before Jesus came and was born in Bethlehem. We're talking about the Jewish religion. And I say that because I think it's important, even in the day and time in which we live, that we separate the difference between Israel as people and Israel as a state and as a religion, the Jewish religion. I think that the Bible makes it very clear with the Abrahamic covenant that those who love the people that are descendants of Abraham will be blessed. Those who don't will be cursed. But I don't think that means we ought to just automatically rubber stamp what the state of Israel does today. There are many things that the government of Israel does today that are not only anti-liberty, but they're right on the verge of socialism and communism, just like some of the things that the government of these United States does. So just because we ought to want to be a blessing to the people that are called Jews today or descendants of the Israelites doesn't mean we have to rubber stamp everything their government or their religion stands for. And so I say that as a disclaimer as we begin, because the purpose tonight is not to intentionally offend anyone, but to share the truth. Because if we don't tell the truth, number one, people don't get saved. Number two, if we don't tell the truth, then we're not doing anyone any good, and they will just continue in their errors. So tonight, our topic is Israel and Mystery Babylon. Now, we're not going to reread all the first 6 verses of Revelation 17 as we begin tonight, but we are going to look at a number of passages in both the New Testament and the Old Testament as we go through. So here's what I'd like you to do tonight, if you would with me. View tonight what I'm about to present to you as a chronological story of the history of Israel. But what we're going to do as we go through the history of Israel is we're going to look at the history of their religion and how they veered off course from worshiping the true and living God. We know, of course, in Jesus' own day and time that the children of Israel were not worshiping God. In fact, Jesus said, "You're of your father, the devil." And so it's not the preacher saying that tonight. That's what Jesus had to say. In our message this morning, in the 11 o'clock service, I brought a message about the great I Am. That was a name that Jesus ascribed to himself. And of course, you and I know that's the same name that God gave Moses back at the burning bush. And so when Jesus said, "I am," the Jews knew, of course, that he was saying that he is God. And that's why they were so upset with it. I'm going to start tonight by reading the same text I read in the 11 o'clock hour this morning, and that's found in John chapter 8. So if you'd like to turn there, I'll give you just a moment to kind of set the stage here. Jesus is teaching and speaking to those that are around. And of course, there are some of the skeptics and the scoffers, both the conservative and the liberal skeptics of Jesus, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and unbelieving Jews in general. In John chapter 8, I'm going to begin reading in verse 48, if you'd like to follow along. "Then answered the Jews and said unto him, Say we not well that thou art a Samaritan, and hast a devil?" In other words, they were accusing Jesus of being demon-possessed because of the things that he taught. Jesus answered, "I have not a devil, but I honor my Father, and ye do dishonor me. And I seek not mine own glory, there is one that seeketh and judgeth. Verily, verily, I say unto you, if a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. Then said the Jews unto him, Now we know that thou hast a devil. Abraham is dead, and the prophets. And thou sayest, If a man keep my saying, he shall never taste of death. Art thou greater than our father Abraham, which is dead? And the prophets are dead. Whom makest thou thyself? Jesus answered, If I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father that honoreth me, of whom ye say that he is your God. Yet ye have not known him, but I know him. And if I should say, I know him not, I shall be a liar like unto you. But I know him, and keep his saying. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it, and was glad. Then said the Jews unto him, Thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Then took they up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. So, in this discussion Jesus is having with the Pharisees and the unbelieving Jews, those Jews are questioning what he's teaching, what he's saying. Jesus says that if they have what he's offering, they shall never taste of death. And so they bring up Abraham and the prophets. And their question is, are you greater than Abraham? You're saying what you have to offer causes someone to never taste of death. And yet Abraham, who was the father of Israel, he's already dead. The prophets are already dead. Are you greater than they? And then Jesus begins to explain that his purpose is to honor the Father, and that the Father honors him. But he tells them, You know not my Father. Now, elsewhere in the New Testament, Jesus on multiple occasions tells these unbelieving Jews they are of their father, the devil. So we know that the Jews in Jesus' day and time were not worshiping the same God that you and I worship. In fact, the Bible tells us that whoever worships the Son worships the Father. And if you reject the Son, then you've rejected the Father. So in rejecting Jesus, these unbelieving Jews whose eyes were covered by their rebellious hearts, their sinfulness, they didn't see Jesus as the Messiah. They rejected Him as the Messiah. Consequently, they weren't worshiping the Father. They were worshiping a God, but the God they were worshiping, though they called Him by the same name as Jehovah, He was altogether a different Jehovah than the Jehovah of this book. It's, to be honest with you, it's not too unlike a lot of Christians in America today who say they have Jesus or they've had a born-again experience with Jesus, but the Jesus that they worship today is not the Jesus of this book. It's a Jesus that they've created out of thin air. They've made Jesus be whatever they want Jesus to be. The curly-headed preacher does it all the time. Rick Warren does it all the time. The rest of that crowd does it all the time. They've made a Jesus who is convenient for them, that will let them do whatever they want to do, be whoever they want to be, with no need for repentance and no need to be right with God. So we know that Israel was in Jesus' day worshiping a false god, not Jesus, and therefore not His Father. So let's go all the way back now to the founding of Israel. The man that God called out of a strange land to be the father of a brand new nation, the man who is considered the father of the Hebrews. What was his name? Abraham. Father Abraham, right? Abraham was called out of what city? Ur. That's right. You are. Now, on the whiteboard over here, I have attempted to draw some of this part of the world that we'll be talking about tonight and that we've talked about numerous times in our study in the book of Revelation and other books we've been studying. This, of course, is the Mediterranean Sea to the far west. Here is Egypt with the Nile River down here below this edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Here is what we think of as the state of Israel today. What's that? You're making fun of my map again?
Oh, no, Caleb is.
Caleb always
Looks like a hot air balloon.
Looks like a hot air balloon. Yes, probably so. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Dead Sea. And here's the Jordan River that flows between the two. Over here further to the east, this is the Persian Gulf. And from the Persian Gulf flow the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And, of course, it is on the Euphrates River that we find the ancient city of Babel, which is the site of the Tower of Babel, and in the same vicinity where the later city of Babylon was built. Now, the city of Ur was located in this same region where Babel was found. The city of Ur was right down here near the Persian Gulf. The entire southern part of this area between the rivers was the land of the Sumerians. You might remember Sumerians from ancient history because they are remembered for being the first that we know of to develop writing. It was the cuneiform language, and there are still many tablets, hundreds of tablets in fact, that have been found intact with cuneiform writing. But here's the city of Ur in the southern part of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. You'll remember that this is also the area that the Bible told us in Genesis chapter 10 and 11, where Nimrod founded the first kingdom on the earth that existed after the flood. So Ur is in the same general vicinity of Nimrod's kingdom, just a little further to the south. Abraham was called out of this region by God. Remember, to go to a place, a land that God would show him, a place he'd never seen before, and God was going to make of him the father of a new nation. So, of course, he ended up in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. We call it the Promised Land. It's the land God promised to Abraham and his descendants. But I start here because that's where Israel starts. God called Abraham out of a place of idolatry, for Ur was right in the midst of the worship of all those false gods and goddesses of Mystery Babylon that we spent the last 2 weeks talking about. So all of those gods and goddesses we learned about, that's where Abraham was. That's the religion that was all around him when God called him out of there to leave and to serve the true and living God. Abraham was not the only one in the world who was still worshiping the true and living God after the flood, but they were few and far between. So he travels with his family to the land of Israel. You know the story. Abraham and his family are there. Isaac ends up having 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob ends up running for his life from Esau. Then he comes back to the land that God had promised to him and to his fathers. And God changed Jacob's name to what? Israel. And Israel had 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, you'll remember one of those sons was Joseph. And Joseph was sold by his brothers to a caravan heading down to Egypt. To the Egyptians, that's right. Eventually, Joseph ends up being the number 2 man in the entire kingdom of Egypt. God uses him to save all of the Egyptian people and many of the neighboring peoples around them because of interpreting Pharaoh's dreams about the coming famine. So, you'll remember that Jacob's sons, the rest of them, ended up traveling down as guests of Joseph, and they settled in Egypt. Now, it's very important that we know and understand what part of Egypt the 12 sons of Israel settled. They settled in this area that is the northernmost part. It's where the Nile Delta is located. In our Bibles, it's called the land of Goshen. And you can see that talked about in Genesis and Exodus. Now, this is important because when the children of Israel go down to Egypt, Pharaoh lets them have that land to settle because it's some of the best land in all the country. That land in the Nile Delta is some of the most fertile land anywhere in the world for growing things. They're there, the Bible tells us, for about 400 years. This is also important, though, because while they are there, the children of Israel become acquainted with a particular worship of the Egyptians. And what I'm about to share with you, I've been a preacher for about 30 years, a pastor for 10 years, but I've been a student of the Bible my entire life, and I never knew what I'm about to share with you till about 2 years ago in studying and doing some in-depth study on my own on this particular subject. I always wondered, why was it that when the children of Israel left Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, why did they build an image of an Egyptian golden calf? Here, I think, is a good part of the reason. In Egypt, where they were located, the city of Memphis is right on the southern portion of the territory known as the land of Goshen. And near Memphis, the Pharaoh who was the Pharaoh, supposedly, when the children of Israel were let go, after spending 400 years there, Ramses II, there's still discussion and debate as to whether he was the actual Pharaoh at that time or not. But Pharaoh Ramses II built a temple near Memphis to the Egyptian god called Apis, A-P-I-S. The Egyptian god Apis was personified don't know if personified is the right word, by a bull, just like the one that's pictured here on the screen. And the Apis bull was considered to be a representation of the sun god, Ra. We talked about Ra being the father of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. He's the equivalent of Nimrod, the equivalent of the chief of the gods in all those other mystery religions that started as a result of the Tower of Babel. The worship of the calf or the bull, the horned god, is what was being practiced right there in Israel's backyard when they left Egypt. The temple that was built by Ramses II there has since been excavated, and it was discovered that what they would do is they would have stalls where at any given time there were 7 prize bulls that were being raised to be worshipped. And they gave these bulls all kinds of gifts, decorated them, they gave them their own harem of cows per bull, but each one was treated like a god, these 7 bulls that were raised there. When one of these Apis bulls died, they had a special ceremonial burial, just like they did for the pharaohs, and they buried them at that temple near Memphis. All of this was going on and was kind of the main worship going on in Egypt at the time that the Israelites left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. So the Israelites, when they leave Egypt and they get over here to Mount Sinai, Moses goes up on top of the mountain. They're worshiping this golden calf when Moses and Joshua come back down the mountain, because that's the religion they had been introduced to before leaving Egypt. The worship of the horned god. But where did the Egyptians get this religion from? Well, the Egyptians had been doing this for quite some time as well, but Ramses II was the one that made it the main thing going on in the land of Egypt during his reign. But the worship of the bull and the worship of this god, the horned god, was actually something Egypt had gotten from Babel, and actually from the ancient civilization of Babylon, that even after the Tower of Babel was destroyed, the city of Babylon was rebuilt and continued to grow and flourish, and was at the time of Egypt's civilization, it was a growing civilization over here. So the worship of the horned god, symbolized by a bull or a bullock, a calf, migrated from Babylon to the Canaanites and down to the Egyptians. That's where the religion came from. And that's why the children of Israel began dancing around the golden calf, because it was something they had picked up from Egypt. Once the children of Israel wander in the desert for 40 years, they then get all the way up to the Promised Land, and finally, the second time, they decide to go into the Promised Land, unlike their parents who lacked the faith to do so 40 years before that. So they go into the Promised Land, and you know the story. As long as Joshua was alive, they served God for the most part, and they conquered most of those people, destroyed them, or ran them out of the land. But when Joshua died, they just kind of stopped doing what they ought to do. That it begins the period known as the Book of the Judges in our Bibles that we've been studying in Sunday school. Now, in that time period that we know as the time of the Judges, and really for most of the rest of the Old Testament, the children of Israel have pagan people surrounding them that are worshiping false gods and goddesses. But they're the same false gods that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks with the whole Nimrod Semiramis story and the infant Tammuz. They just have different names depending on which culture we're talking about. But if you look up here at the map, we'll attempt to show you where some of those are. First of all, here in the land of Canaan, the Canaanites, their chief god, which is the same as this horned god, is known by the name of Baal. Now, we're familiar with the worship of Baal by the Canaanites. If you'll remember the story of Gideon, before Gideon goes out and defeats the Amalekites in that great battle that he's so famous for, God had given him a test of his faith. And the test God gave him was to go to his daddy's house to find the 2 young bulls that his daddy was raising in worship of Baal. He was to kill those 2 young bullocks, cut down the grove of trees where they were worshiping Baal on his daddy's property in the middle of town, and he was to tear down the altar to Baal. So those bulls, calves, they were being raised by the Canaanites to worship Baal. So the worship of Baal is the same as this worship of the Apis bulls down in Egypt. It's the same as the worship over in Babylon of their chief god that is known as Baal, or sometimes he's called Baal Marduk. He's the chief of the god of the Babylonians, but he's the same god, the horned god that we talked about. You'll remember we talked about 2 weeks ago that the horned god is represented either by a bull with horns, or a goat with horns, or on occasion the great horned owl with the tufts of feathers sticking up that look like horns. The Canaanites were worshiping the same worship system as the Egyptians, who were doing the same thing the Babylonians were doing. Also over here in neighboring the Israelites, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, this area was the land of the Ammonites. Just to the south of the Ammonites were the Moabites. And then a little bit farther to the southeast were the Edomites. The Moabites worshiped a god that's referenced over and over in the Old Testament. His name is Molech. You've undoubtedly heard preachers talk about, if you've been here long enough, you've heard this preacher talk about the worship of Molech, because the worship of Molech involved the sacrifice of children. Molech was pictured as having a bull's head with horns and a man's body. Here's a painting of someone's representation of what they think the statue of Moloch may have looked like. But again, it's got the bull's head with the horns, a man's body with outstretched arms, and it was in those outstretched arms where they would place infants that would be literally burned to death as child sacrifices. That's the worship of Moloch, of the Ammonites. Just to the south of the Ammonites were the Moabites, and the Moabites worship the same God as the Ammonites, but by a different name, and it has just slipped right out of my mind, so as soon as I remember it, I'll put it up here too. They're all worshiping the same horned god as the chief of the gods, but just by different names. Also, over here to the north of Israel were the people that we know as the Phoenicians, a seafaring people. In the Bible, they're called the Zidonians because they had 2 main cities, Tyre and Sidon. That's right. The Zidonians worship the same horned god, but in a little bit different twist. They called him, we've seen this in the book of Judges in our Sunday school class, Baal Berith. And the English spelling of the name Berith, the English transliteration is Beirut. That's also the reason that the modern day capital of Lebanon is the city of Beirut, Lebanon, which is located just north of Israel today. It's named after the god Baal Berith that the Zidonians worshipped. Baal Berith is not by the same name, but is also worshipped by the Philistines, who were down here on the southern coast of the land of Israel. The Philistines worshipped Baal Berith under a different name. They worshipped him and called him Baal Zebub, which is what Jesus calls Beelzebub in the New Testament. You and I know that when Jesus talked about Beelzebub, he was talking about the devil himself. In the book of Revelation, we also see the name Beelzebub. It is Baal Zebub. This, by the way, literally means, the name Baal means Lord. So this name Beelzebub means Lord of the, anybody remember? What? Lord of the flies. That's what it literally means. I have some pictures that were representations of that, if I can find them. This is supposed to be from a book written, so it's just an artist rendition. But again, you see the horned god and the fly both together there. And here is another artist rendition of Baal Berith, the Lord of the Flies. Just a different version, a different image of Baal himself. But as you see, all of those people around Israel were worshiping the same horned god as their chief deity. They just called him by a different name depending on what culture it was. But it all goes back. That's why the children of Israel were worshiping the golden calf when they came out of Egypt. When they get to the land of Israel, in the book of Judges, the Bible tells us that they began to worship these false gods. That's why all throughout the book of Judges, time and time again, the children of Israel fall into idolatry, and God has to discipline them by allowing them to be oppressed by neighboring people because they fell into idolatry to one or another of these false gods. I just remembered the name that the Moabites called their god, Chemosh or Chemosh. But he's the same as Molech, who is the same as Baal in these different religions. He's the same God, just different names and somewhat different representations. Now, even after the period of the judges in the Bible, the children of Israel continued to worship these false gods even when they had kings. Israel only had 3 kings of the United Kingdom of Israel before it split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. That was Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon, he's considered the wisest man who ever lived. But in some respects, Solomon wasn't all that wise. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, with me to 1 Kings chapter number 11. In 1 Kings chapter 11, we see a description of what happened to Solomon and how his wisdom somewhat failed him as king. 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, here's what it says. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. By the way, when he falls in love with these women and invites them to come live in the palace, guess what they're bringing with them? Their false gods and goddesses. Verse 2. Of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go in unto them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. One preacher said, I don't know how wise he was if he had that many wives. Nevertheless, just exactly what God said would happen is what happened. They turned away his heart.
What chapter was that?
1 Kings chapter 11.
First verse.
Yes, ma'am. Because of wanting to please the wives, he let them bring their gods and goddesses in. He let them bring them in. Then he gave them a place to set up their gods and goddesses. And before you know it, the king of Israel himself was actively participating in the worship of all these different gods and goddesses that he had collected while he was collecting wives. Look at verse 4. For it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. That's another name for Molech, by the way. Milcom and Molech are the same. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. So what this tells us is that Solomon began worshiping all these strange gods and goddesses. And of course, Israel followed right after their king. So we see here that they're already following a different religion than the God they're supposed to be worshiping, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But we're only halfway through the story. Let me speed up just a little bit. In the book of Jeremiah, we see reference to the worship by the children of Israel of the Queen of Heaven. We know who that is. It's the story of Semiramis and the infant that was supposedly born by the rays from the sun. The infant's name is Tammuz. Semiramis' name in the book of Jeremiah is the Queen of Heaven. The Bible says that the Israelites were baking cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. So there's another tie-in to Mystery Babylon that even the children of Israel were participating in. The Bible also tells us in the verses we looked at 2 weeks ago that the children of Israel were worshiping the infant Tammuz, born on the winter solstice. And that the women of Israel in springtime would weep for Tammuz in the hopes that he would bring them greater harvest when it was time to bring in the harvest. So we see the worship of the Queen of Heaven, the worship of Tammuz. Now look what the prophet Amos says. Actually, let me hold that thought before we go to Amos. All of this happens before Israel falls apart. The northern kingdom of Israel goes into Assyrian captivity. But the southern kingdom of Judah remained for more than 100 years more because of their faithfulness to God. But eventually, over time, they too fell into idolatry. You know the story of how Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came into Israel, came into Judah, and besieged the city of Jerusalem. And 3 different times Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city and captured it. Each time he took more of the treasure and more of the people out of the city back home with him to Babylon. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were 4 of those young people taken back. I've often wondered why it was that God allowed the children of Israel, even because of their idolatry, in spite of that, why would He allow them to be taken captive by the Babylonians instead of some group closer by? I think we know the answer. The truth of the matter is, I believe that the reason God allowed them to go into captivity in Babylon is because that's where their heart is. That's where their heart was in Babylon. You say, how was their heart in Babylon? It's because the religion they had started worshiping found its roots, its foundation, back in Babylon. Their heart was already in Babylon. I'll show you one image up here on the screen. This is an ancient Babylonian relief, and I don't know if you can see it or not, but the figure on the right is supposed to be the semblance of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. That's the Semiramis of the story we've talked about, of Mystery Babylon. But she's holding a scepter, and atop the scepter there is an early version of what we today would call the Star of David. Except this Star of David she's holding was around for thousands of years before there was a supposed Star of David and the modern people of Israel, even before there was a kingdom of Israel. This is an ancient Babylonian relief, and it shows that part of the worship of the ancient Babylonian religion incorporated the so-called Star of David. Now, I'm going to say more about the Star of David here in just a minute. It's not the Star of David. There's no place in Scripture where there is ever a mention of a Star of David. There's nothing in the Talmud traditions that are written down of the Jews that mentions a Star of David. It is actually a star that was associated with the worship in ancient Babylon. After the children of Israel were taken into Babylonian captivity, they were there for how many years? 70 years. Who was the Old Testament prophet that foretold how many years they would be in captivity in Babylon before it ever happened? Jeremiah, that's right. When they finally were allowed to return back to the land after 70 years of being gone, and they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, though on a smaller scale, it wasn't long before they again fell back into idolatry. Look at Amos chapter 5 in the Old Testament. Amos is near the end of the Old Testament. His book is considered one of the minor prophets, again, not because it's less important, but because it's shorter than some of the major prophets. In Amos chapter 5, look at verses 26 and 27. I'll start in verse 25. Have ye offered unto me, this is God speaking to Israel, have ye offered unto me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? But ye have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and Chiun your images, the star of your God, which ye made to yourselves. Therefore will I cause you to go into captivity beyond Damascus, saith the Lord, whose name is the God of hosts. This is, again, a prophecy, a prediction that the people of God would be taken into captivity because of worshiping Moloch, Chiun or Chiun, and the star of their God. There's nowhere in Scripture that Jehovah and the worship of Jehovah is associated with worshiping a star. There is a religion that is associated with the worship of a star, though. It's the religion of ancient Babylon. There is the Star of David that's associated with the worship of Mystery Babylon. as we talked about with the original story of Nimrod, the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars, astrology, all of that was part of the worship that took place at the Tower of Babel. Here's another ancient Babylonian relief where you can see the sun, the moon, and various stars all being the center focus of the worship of their religion that's being discussed or portrayed in this particular relief. So why did God send them into captivity to Babylon? It's because that's the religion they were already following. That's where their hearts already were. I think it's ironic that God sent them into captivity to the place that was the capital, the origin of the religion they were practicing way back in the land of Canaan, in the Promised Land. They were worshiping Mystery Babylon, so God sent them into exile in Babylon for 70 years. Now that brings us all the way up eventually to Jesus' day and time. We read the passage in John chapter 8 where Jesus tells the unbelieving Jews that they do not worship the Father, that He worships the Father. Now turn with me, if you would, to the book of Acts, chapter number 7. We're getting close to the conclusion here, so stay with me just a few minutes longer. In Acts chapter 7, we have recorded the sermon that Stephen preached just before he was martyred. The Jews had accused him of blasphemy for worshiping Jesus as the Messiah. But before they martyred him, look at a few of the things he said about the God of their fathers and about the gods they were worshiping. Acts chapter 7, look at verse 38. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles to give unto us. He's talking about Moses going up in Mount Sinai and God giving him the 10 Commandments. Look at verse 39. To whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them, that is, thrust God from them, and in their hearts turned back again into Egypt. So their hearts went back to Egypt, saying unto Aaron, make us gods to go before us. For as for this Moses, which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And they made a calf in those days, and offered sacrifices unto the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. By the way, the host of heaven is the sun, the moon, and the stars. As it is written in the book of the prophets, O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness. Now we just read that in Amos. Look what else he's about to quote the book of Amos here in verse 43. Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So here Stephen is quoting that passage in Amos that we just looked at a moment ago, and he's saying they worshipped, that is the unbelieving Jews, their forefathers, worshipped Moloch and the star of their god, which he called Remphan. Now, which god was worshipped with a star? Was it Jehovah? No. It was Moloch. And the star that they claim in ancient Babylon they were worshiping is the same god that the Romans worshipped as the deity in the heavens that pictured their chief god, Saturn. We know it as a planet, Saturn, but that's the star they were worshiping, the star Saturn, which is just another name for Satan. And just as the Babylonians worshiped that star, so too did the Ammonites and the Canaanites under the name Molech, Baal, Chemosh. But he's the same God. He's the horned God, the chief of their deities. And Stephen says they carried around banners with the star of their God that they worshipped. And folks, it wasn't the Star of David, but it was the star of Remphan. It was the star that embodied the religion they had chosen instead of the true and living God. Now, Stephen's saying this in the same day and time in which Jesus lived. The Jews in Jesus' day were not worshiping Jehovah. They were worshiping the god Moloch. And they were worshiping with the use of the symbol of his star. I submit to you, dear friends, that is what the so-called Star of David is that's on the flag of Israel today. It is not the Star of David. There is nowhere in Scripture that a star is associated with David. It is the star of the false worship of Moloch. I have numerous examples here. I won't take time to show them all, but there are numerous examples that picture the Star of David. Here, for example, is the Star of David 300 years before the birth of Christ in remains of a Roman temple that was found in ancient Egypt. I assure you the Romans weren't practicing Judaism. The Egyptians were not practicing Judaism. They were the avowed enemies of the Israelites. They have the Star of David because it was part of their pagan religion. Nothing to do with Judaism. Nothing to do with the people of Israel. By the way, in our own culture, our own country, you see, here's an example of it on the dollar bill. I don't know if you've ever looked on the stars that are pictured there. They're in the shape of a Star of David, which is a six-pointed star. The six-pointed star, of course, is actually a hexagram. The hexagram, the six-pointed star, is considered one of the most powerful symbols in the occult, in witchcraft. Those in the occult who are wanting to summon powers to cast spells or hexes on people, they draw the hexagram, the six-pointed star, and put a circle around it. That's the reason that we use the phrase putting a hex on someone, because in witchcraft, it's the six-pointed star that they used. Dear friends, the six-pointed star is not in any way a symbol of God or God's chosen people. It is a symbol of the ancient religion of Babylon. Here's another picture of the Star of David from an ancient Buddhist mosaic. On the right-hand side is an ancient Hindu fresco. And you see there's the so-called Star of David found in ancient India and ancient China. Well, they had no contact with the Jews. This was simply part of the worship of their false gods and goddesses. The symbol is exactly what we've talked about for the 2 previous weeks. It's a symbol that is as old as the Tower of Babel. The symbol represents Mystery Babylon, not Israel. By the way, the one in the middle there is purported to be an ancient Canaanite relief of the Star of David before the Jews even arrived there in the land by those that were worshiping Moloch. Here is another place that you'll find the so-called Star of David, and that's on the Pope's mitre. You see the Pope wearing a mitre that has the six-pointed hexagram called the Star of David. I assure you, Roman Catholicism is not part of Judaism. The Jews today to kind of wrap all of this up, are worshiping the same God that their fathers worshipped in Jesus' day and time. He is not the God of the Bible. For if they were worshiping the God of the Bible, they would accept Jesus as the Messiah. For Jesus is God. The fact that they reject Jesus as the Messiah means they're not worshiping the same God that you and I worship. Jesus said if they accepted Him, if they were truly worshiping the Father, they would receive Him.
Awesome.
I know there are people today who think that the Jews worship the same God we do. They're just worshiping God the Father, but not God the Son. Folks, that's not the case. Modern Jews and Jews in Jesus' day are not worshiping the same God the Father you and I worship that's part of the Trinity. They're worshiping a different God the Father. His name is Baal. His name is Bel. His name is Moloch, Chemosh, and they use the star of their God to symbolize their worship. But it's not worship of the true and living God. Satan has a plan just like God has a plan. We've talked about that all through the book of Revelation. Satan's plan is a counterfeit plan. God's plan is the real plan. The children of Israel, beginning in 1917 with the Balfour Agreement, were told that they would be given their own state in the Middle East to live in the land of their fathers. Many Jews began migrating back to that place. And it was not until 1948 that the official modern state of Israel was officially recognized as a country. Those behind the Zionist movement to return to the land and start their own country were not believing Jews. They were unbelieving Jews. Those who adopted the Star of David as their national symbol and their national flag, they were not believing Jews. Those who created the modern state of Israel were not believing Jews. They're unbelieving Jews. The Rothschild family and many other wealthy, prominent Jewish families from around the world financed much of the Zionist movement. But they do not worship the God of this book. The religion of Jews today is following a collection of mystery religions that the Jews call the Kabbalah. The Jews today do not primarily follow the written word of God, which they call the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the law. They don't even regard the writings of their older Jewish leaders, the Talmud, as their greater authority. They are Kabbalistic. The Kabbalah is a collection of ancient Jewish riddles and mysteries. It is also the basis for another organization we've mentioned but haven't talked about, the Freemasons. All 33 rites and degrees of Freemasonry are based upon the Kabbalah, which is different than this book. Albert Pike, who wrote Morals and Dogma, it's considered the Bible of Freemasonry, he admitted that if you took the Kabbalah and modern Judaism out of Freemasonry, you wouldn't have any Freemasonry. So this religion that has taken over the Jewish people today, they've been misled just like all the other peoples of the world have been misled into following Mystery Babylon. I think that's one of the reasons that when the Antichrist comes on the scene in the tribulation period, he and Israel will be able to make that 7-year covenant. After all, they're worshiping the same God. They just haven't acknowledged it yet. They use the same symbols. They just haven't acknowledged it's the same religion yet. Satan is bringing all of the descendants of Abraham back to the land today, I believe, so he can try to exterminate them like he's been trying to do for over 1,000 years. 3,000 years. God has a plan too, though. God is bringing them back together so that they can be purified during the tribulation period. And that little group that remains just before Jesus comes back, that remnant that finally recognizes Him as the Messiah and cries out for Him when He splits the eastern sky at the second coming, the end of the tribulation, He's got to get them all back to the land so the rest of them can be purified, and those that will believe on Him will be there ready to return to the land. Satan's got a totally different reason for bringing them all back together than God's plan for bringing them back together. But God's allowing it to happen because God's the one in charge. And He's going to use it for His plan, even though Satan thinks he's going to do something entirely different. But the Star of David is not the Star of God or the Star of David. Not our God. The people of Israel today are worshiping Mystery Babylon, just like the Roman Catholics are, just like the Buddhists are, just like the Hindus are, just like all those people around the world in man-made religions. And that's why it's going to be so easy for even Israel to fall for the words of the antichrist in the tribulation period. All right, we've covered a whole lot of ground. I've never covered that much material in that amount of time. Does anybody have any questions or comments about anything we've covered tonight?